Before you proceed, please subscribe and click the bell button for more updates.
Good day everyone, my name is Teacher Claire. Welcome to another lesson of Facilitating Learning. In this lesson, we will be discussing the Behaviorist Perspective. The learning objective for this lesson is to explain the basic learning principles of behaviorism. Behaviorists believe that all behaviors are the result of experience. Any person, regardless of his or her background, can be trained to act in a particular manner, given the right conditioning. What is behaviorism in education? Behaviorism is defined in the following ways by scholarly sources. Behaviorism is a theory that views learning as a cause and effect mechanism in which external factors lead to a response, and over time, this response becomes a learned behavior. The main feature of behaviorism is that learning is conditioned by external events or forces. Behaviorism, on the other hand, is a learning theory focusing on observable behaviors and discounting any mental activity. Accordingly, learning is simply defined as the acquisition of new behavior. The behaviorist perspective is divided into two groups. First is behaviorism and second is neo-behaviorism. Behaviorism is a theory that gives emphasis that a behavior is mostly learned through conditioning and reinforcement. The theory of behaviorism focuses only on the study of observable and measurable behavior. Cognitions, emotions, and moods are far too subjective. Under this behaviorism theory are Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning, Edward Thorndike's Connectionism theory, and B.F. Skinner's Operant conditioning. The first theory under behaviorism is Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning theory. He is known for his work in classical conditioning or stimulus substitution. His first renowned experiment involved a meat, a dog, and a bell. There are three phases of this process: before, during, and after conditioning. During the first phase of the process, the unconditioned stimulus, or the UCS, or what we call as the results in an unconditioned response, or the UCR, for example, presenting a meat, that is the UCS, is naturally and automatically triggers as a salivation process or the unconditioned response. At this point, there is also a neutral stimulus that produces no effect. Yet, it isn't until this neutral stimulus is paired with the UCS that it will come to evoke a response. Let's take a closer look at the two critical components of this phase of classical conditioning. First is the unconditioned stimulus. It is one that unconditionally, naturally, and automatically triggers a response. For example, when you smell one of your favorite foods, you may immediately feel hungry. In this example, the smell of food is the unconditioned stimulus. The second component is the uncontrolled response. It is the unlearned response that occurs naturally in response to the unconditioned stimulus. In our example, the feeling of hunger and response to the smell of food is the unconditioned response. In the before conditioning phase, the unconditioned stimulus is paired with the unconditioned response. A new stimulus is then introduced. However, during conditioning phase, it involves pairing a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. Eventually, the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. As a result of this pairing, an association between the previously neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is formed. At this point, and the once neutral stimulus becomes known as the conditioned stimulus or CS. After becoming associated with the unconditioned stimulus, it then comes to trigger a conditioned response. So, after conditioning, the conditioned stimulus alone triggers the conditioned response. In the study of Pavlov, his findings were the following. First is the stimulus generalization. According to him, once the dog has learned to salivate by only hearing the sound of the bell, it will start to salivate when the dog hears another similar sound to the bell. Next is the extinction. If you have discontinued pairing the bell with food, salivation will eventually cease in a response to the bell. Another finding is spontaneous recovery. With this, extinguished responses can be recovered after a time, but soon it will extinguish if the dog is presented with food. Next theory is Edward Thorndike's Connectionism theory. Thorndike was one of the first researchers to explore and attempt to outline the three laws of learning. He explained that learning is the result of associations forming between stimuli and response. Accordingly, the law of effect states that the connection between the stimulus and response is strengthened when the consequence is positive, but the connection weakens when the consequence is negative. However, he revised this law when he found that punishment does not necessarily weaken connection, and that some rewards do not assume motivation in performance. Law of exercise, on the other hand, states that the more stimulus-response bond is practiced, the stronger it will become. However, like the law of effect, this law has to be revised when he found out that practice without feedback does not necessarily enhance performance. Next is the law of readiness. If the learner has to respond to stimulus, the stronger will be the bond between them. When a learner is ready to respond to a particular stimulus but was not given the chance to respond, it annoys the person. Likewise, when a learner is not at all ready to respond and is asked to respond, it also annoys the learner. Next is B.F. Skinner operant conditioning. Operant conditioning was first described by Burroughs Frederick Skinner. Operant conditioning relies on a fairly simple premise, that is, actions that are formed by reinforcement will be strengthened and more likely to reoccur in the future. On the other hand, actions that result in punishment or undesirable consequences will be weakened and thus less likely to occur again in the future. So, reinforcement is the key element in Skinner's theory. A reinforcer is anything that strengthens the desired response. According to this theory, there are two kinds of reinforcers. The positive reinforcer, which is a stimulus that is given or added to increase the response. For example, a teacher promises a bonus point to her students who have behaved during the lesson. Second is the negative reinforcer. This is a stimulus that results in an increased frequency of response when it is withdrawn or removed. Note that in this theory, a negative reinforcer is not a punishment, but it is a reward. For example, a teacher announces that students in CPE 104 who gets a grade of 1.25 during their midterm exam will no longer take the final examination. In this illustration, a negative reinforcer is the removal of the final exam. Let's move on to Edward Tolman's Purposive Behaviorism. His concepts are as follows. First, learning is always purposive and goal-directed. He held the notion that an organism acted or responded for some adaptive purpose. He believed that individuals do more than merely respond to a specific stimulus. They acted based on beliefs, attitudes, changing conditions, and they strive toward their goals. Another concept is the cognitive map in rats. This experiment includes putting a rat at a random starting location in a maze. He observed that a rat placed on the same location will select the shortest or easiest path to achieve a specific goal. Next concept is the latent learning. This learning remains or stays with the individual until needed. It is the kind of learning where it is not outwardly manifested at once. According to Tolman, it can exist even without a reinforcement. Another concept is the intervening variables. This refers to those that are not readily seen but serve as determinants of behavior. Tolman believed that learning is mediated or influenced by the expectations, perceptions, representations, need, and other internal or environmental variables. Is Tolman's conclusion that reinforcement is not essential for learning, although it serves as an incentive for performance. Finally, we have Albert Bandura's social learning theory. There are three main concepts of social learning theory. First, people can learn through observation. Next is that with the notion that internal mental states are an essential part of this process, and it recognizes the idea that just because something has been learned, it does not necessarily result in a change of behavior. Let's explore each of these concepts in greater depth. First, people can learn through observation. In his experiment, he let children observe an adult acting violently toward a boba doll. Later, he then allowed the children to play in a room with a boba doll. In that scenario, these children began to imitate the aggressive actions they had previously observed. Another core concept is the importance of mental state to learning. Bandura emphasized that a reinforcement does not always come from outside forces. To him, mental state and motivation play an important role in determining whether a behavior is learned or not. He described intrinsic reinforcement as a form of internal reward such as pride, satisfaction, and a sense of accomplishment. This emphasis on internal thoughts and commissions help connect learning theories to cognitive development theories when many textbooks place social learning theory with behavioral theories. Bandura himself described his approach as a social learning theory. Third is learning does not necessarily lead to change. So, how do we determine when something has been learned? In many cases, learning can be seen immediately when the new behavior is displayed. But sometimes, we're able to learn things even though that learning was not immediately obvious. However, behaviorists believe that learning led to a permanent change in behavior. Observational learning demonstrates that people can learn new information without demonstrating new behaviors. For this, again, I would like to say thank you for watching this video, and it's my prayer that you were able to capture the vital information shared through this video.